My husband and I visited Sunwatch Indian Village on May 20th, 2007. This scrapbook documents our visit and provides answers to the assigned questions. I hope you enjoy it. Sunwatch is a partially reconstructed Indian village. 800 years ago, it was inhabited by the last prehistoric society in Ohio, the Fort Ancient Indians. Sunwatch was first discovered in 1960 by amateur archaeologists. In the early 70s, the city of Dayton made plans to expand a nearby sewage treatment plant. The amateur archaeologists contacted the curator of anthropology at the Dayton Museum of Natural History. They began emergency excavations to recover what artifacts and information they could. During the excavations, a village was discovered with several well-preserved artifacts and a suspected astrological pattern. The city of Dayton modified their plans and the site was saved from destruction. 17 years later, Sunwatch opened to the public. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of a planned village protected by a stockade and arranged around what is believed to be a sun calendar. They also discovered crayfish pinchers, turkey egg shells, uncharred wood, plant remains, and other artifacts. These artifacts include chipped stone tools, arrowheads, pottery, and bones. There is also evidence of houses being built with upright poles and burnt-down houses. Sunwatch was a prehistoric Indian village that was occupied around 1200 A.D. The inhabitants were Ohio's first farmers, raising corn, beans, squash, gourds, and sunflowers. The Fort Ancient Indians survived on the corn they grew, supplemented by gathered plants and occasionally meat. The women and children grew food in the family plots, while the men hunted small game and fished in the river. There was a strong social organization in the village, which was demonstrated by the circular bands the village was arranged in. Their houses were made of wood poles used for farming, and weaved prairie grasses and sticks were attached to the walls and then plastered with a mud mixture. The roofs were covered with grasses or bark. The houses were family dwellings and were home to 6 to 10 people. There were also community buildings such as the big house and the men's lodge. Bell-shaped pits were discovered that were used for food storage and then trash disposal once they lost their usefulness. The center posts in the village were used to interpret the sun and to help them decide when to plant and harvest crops. Some even say that the entire village was laid out to be used as a calendar. They believe that over half the children died before the age of 6 and that the adults did not live past 40. The adults were stricken with arthritis, dental problems, and contagious diseases. The Fort Ancient Indians lived in matriloquial patterns, which means that closely related females lived near one another in the village. When a couple was married, they moved into a house near the bride's mother. The Fort Ancient Indians were not nomadic. This was evidenced by their permanent housing, the crops they grew, and that they are believed to have lived in the village for 20 years. The thing that surprised me most during my visit was the fact that they do not know where the Fort Ancient Indians went after leaving the village. Also, through other research, I discovered that most of the Fort Ancient Indian villages were abandoned, and it is unknown where they went or why they left. It amazes me to this day no one has found evidence of where they disappeared to. I was also surprised by how exact and intricate the village was laid out. One assumes that a prehistoric society would not have the intelligence to line up houses in conjunction with poles to document sun position. The last thing that surprised me was that there were even Fort Ancient Indians. I have heard of most Indian societies in and around Ohio, the Cherokee, the Hopewell, the Adena people, but had never heard of the Fort Ancient Indians until my visit. I did find out during online research that the Adena and Hopewell Indians might possibly be ancestors of the Fort Ancient Indians. The first thing that we learned in this class related to Fort Ancient Indians is that they were a horticultural society which was supplemented by food gathering. This was discussed in Chapter 7 of our book. By the way, my references are located on the last slide in the presentation. In Chapter 1, we also learned about different types of material culture that archaeologists study. Artifacts can be demonstrated by the pottery, arrowheads, and tools that were found in the village. Features can be demonstrated by the storage and trash pits that were discovered. Ecofacts can be demonstrated by the bones that were found. We learned in Chapter 10 about kinship systems. There is evidence that the Fort Ancient Indians followed a matriloquial residence pattern. The females of the village lived near one another, and husbands moved to be near the wife's mother. I would also assume, and perhaps be incorrect, that the Fort Ancient Indians also followed a matrilineal kinship system due to the evidence of the matriloquial residence patterns. Public archaeology is using the science to involve visitors in learning about archaeology, discovering cultures, learning how to preserve found items, and to introduce newbies to archaeology. I believe this concept of public archaeology is demonstrated by the programs, classes, and special events that Sunwatch conducts to teach about the Fort Ancient Indian culture. While trying to answer the question concerning how Sunwatch conducts its research, I visited the Boonshoft Museum's website. It states that most of the excavation of Sunwatch was handled by non-archaeologist volunteers, and their findings were interpreted by the Dayton Museum of Natural History's Anthropology department. Native American groups are concerned about museums such as Sunwatch because they believe these museums are portraying them as lost cultures that no longer exist. They also believe that most museums lump them together under the term of Indian and do not discuss their individual differences. These groups claim that cultural items are displayed insensitively and inaccurately, especially funeral and ceremonial items. I do not have a problem with museums displaying human remains as long as they are displayed tactfully and with respect. I think that groups that are protesting this need to stop and realize that this is our history. These items are history. This would be tantamount to human rights activists protesting displays of dinosaur bones. Granted, they are entitled to their opinion, this is America, but to protest a display of a mummy or other remains in honor of education, that's just ignorant. I'm a firm believer in turning the channel if you do not like something, do not read a book if you think it should be banned. So if they disagree with the practice, perhaps they should not visit the museum. I would go visit these museums. I think it is interesting to see these items and learn about them. Of course, I read banned books, so maybe I'm not a good judge of right and wrong. An interesting side note for the conclusion of this presentation, I had mentioned earlier that I had never heard of the Fort Ancient Indians before visiting Sunwatch. I did a quick Google and discovered that there were several Fort Ancient Indian villages in Ohio and West Virginia. I found one article about Fort Ancient Indians living in Kanawha Valley, West Virginia. This struck me as odd because my husband and I were just in Kanawha Valley drag racing in October. In fact, we won our first Super Pro race there. The article states that most of the documented sites in Kanawha Valley have been destroyed, and the surviving ones have not been documented properly or at all. It makes me wonder how much of Ohio's Indian history has been lost due to ignorance or mistakes.